Story 1. Until I hit my mid-20s, I lived in a small coastal town. My neighborhood was about a 20-minute walk from the shoreline, and honestly, most of my personality revolved around the beach. I had been surfing longer than I had been talking, and finding sand in my shoes was just a normal part of my life. My two best buddies, let's call them Adam and Charlie, were the outgoing and bold types. Back then, we were all 18, and to put it simply, we were obsessed with girls. It was a Saturday night in late May, just weeks before graduation. Senioritis had kicked in hard, and we were constantly testing how much we could get away with without facing real trouble. Since we already had our college acceptances locked in, high school felt like an afterthought. Adam and I had made plans to meet up with two girls from our school that we had been getting along with really well. The plan was simple: pick them up, head to the beach, and enjoy a cool, breezy night. We packed blankets and a couple of bottles of wine, thinking it was the perfect setup for stargazing. Now, let me be clear. I do not condone drinking and driving, but back then, we were just a bunch of reckless kids. I picked up Emma and Rachel around 9 that night. The way they danced their way to the car made it obvious they had already been drinking. Adam and I exchanged excited looks. It was going to be a fun night. I decided to take the scenic route to a secluded beach about 30 minutes away. The car ride was filled with jokes and random deep conversations about time, death, and everything in between. We were genuinely enjoying ourselves. The beach I chose had a dirt road that you could drive up, followed by a narrow, sandy path leading down to the shore. It was a steep walk, but the spot was secluded, perfect for privacy and clear skies for stargazing. I parked as far up the dirt road as possible, and we grabbed the blankets and wine before heading down to the sand. Fast forward a couple of hours, and the wine bottle was empty. Adam and Rachel wandered off down the beach, leaving Emma and me to ourselves. After walking a bit, we threw down a blanket and lay down. Before anything happened, Emma suddenly tensed up. At first, I thought I had done something wrong, but then she whispered, "Do you hear that?" I strained my ears, but all I could make out was the sound of waves. I figured she was just tipsy, but then I heard it too. A faint whirring, like a small engine. The noise seemed to move around, making it impossible to pinpoint. Then it faded away, and I brushed it off, eager to get back to what we were doing. Just as I was pulling my shirt back on, Emma screamed. I turned to see her pointing up at the sky. I looked but didn't see anything at first. Then, as I sat down to get a better angle, my stomach dropped. From her perspective, the moon was perfectly aligned with what looked like a drone hovering above us. It stayed there for a moment before zipping off into the night. Everything clicked. That sound we heard earlier? It had to be the drone. I felt sick thinking about how we had been watched the entire time. Emma looked equally disturbed and started crying. I comforted her the best I could and suggested we head back to the car. When we got there, Adam and Rachel were already waiting. I quickly explained what had happened, and their expressions shifted from joy to dread. The drive back to Emma's house was silent. The girls were too shaken to go home, and since none of our houses were an option, we called Charlie. He lived in a massive house, and his parents were laid back. Thankfully, he was home and told us to come over. When we arrived, Adam and the girls went inside, but I stayed in the car for a moment to process everything. I leaned my head on the steering wheel, trying to calm down. After a few seconds, I instinctively grabbed my phone for the first time that night. What I saw on the screen made my blood run cold. A single notification: AirTag found moving with you. Panic hit me like a truck. We were being tracked. I jumped out of the car and started searching every inch of it. The front bumper, the grille, the back bumper. Nothing. I checked under the seats and flipped the floor mats. Still nothing. Desperation set in as sweat poured down my neck. Finally, I dropped to my knees and checked under the car. And there it was, an AirTag, taped to the inside of the driver's side wheel well. It was nearly impossible to find unless you knew exactly where to look. I ripped it off, smashed it into pieces, and sprinted to the front door. I showed everyone what I had found, and the panic in the room skyrocketed. The girls checked their phones and saw the same notification. Charlie was furious that someone might have tracked us to his house. After calming down, we decided to spend the night in his basement. Weeks passed, and we tried to put the whole thing behind us, chalking it up to some creep trying to scare us. But about 3 weeks later, I got a call from Charlie. He told me to come over immediately. When I got there, he was standing in his driveway, holding what looked like papers. As I got closer, I realized they were pictures, grainy, dimly lit photos of me and Emma from that night on the beach. My stomach churned thinking about how Emma would react. We called the police, but they told us there was not much they could do. They scanned the photos for fingerprints, but nothing came up. Emma was terrified of being blackmailed, and honestly, I felt the same. Thankfully, nothing ever came of it, probably because we involved the police. Still, Emma and I never really talked much after that night. I cannot blame her. To this day, I just hope those pictures never resurface. Story 2. My best friend, Ryan, and I were both 19 at the time. Now, I know this might sound a bit pretentious, but the two of us came from pretty well-off families in North Jersey. Every summer, we were lucky enough to spend our time down at the Jersey Shore. My family's beach house was in Belmar, New Jersey, and Ryan's was in Lavallette. It was one of those random summer nights during the week, and Ryan was driving us from my place in Belmar down to his in Lavallette, a trip that usually took about an hour. To be honest, I always preferred hanging out at Ryan's place. It was a little nicer, and the overall vibe in Lavallette just felt more suited for people our age. If we weren't hopping around looking for parties, we'd often just bring some drinks and hang out on one of the private beaches where we technically weren't supposed to be. I could probably ramble on forever about all the things to do down the shore, but for the sake of the story, I'll get to the point. That night, we decided to take it easy. No parties or anything wild. Instead, we figured we'd grab a few beers, roll a joint, and just chill under the stars on one of the private beaches. Honestly, it sounded perfect. We'd been partying pretty hard with friends recently, so a laid-back night sounded like exactly what we needed. For those who don't know the layout of Lavallette, there's the beach side and the bay side. Most of the beaches there have these tall sand dunes and steep drop-offs as you approach the water. If you stood at the edge of the ocean and looked back, all you'd see was a big hill of sand separating the beach from the rest of the world. After having a couple of drinks at Ryan's house, we grabbed a couple of bikes from his garage and rode toward the beach. For some reason, Ryan was set on going further down the shore than we usually did. I didn't really see the point since most of the beaches looked the same, but I didn't mind the longer bike ride. Eventually, we stopped at this super isolated beach at the end of the road. No cars were parked nearby, and every house along the street was completely dark. Honestly, I kind of liked it that way. Back then, weed was still illegal in New Jersey, and we weren't exactly eager to get caught. Plus, we were both underage and had drinks with us, so staying out of sight felt like a good idea. We hid our bikes in some bushes and headed down toward the beach. We lit the joint and passed it back and forth while sipping our drinks. The sound of the waves rolling in and the wind blowing across the sand created this peaceful vibe. The beach stretched endlessly in both directions, and the cool sand felt great under our feet. After a while, we just laid back, staring up at the stars, hoping to catch sight of a shooting star. And that's when it happened. At first, I barely noticed it. There was this faint metallic buzzing sound, kind of like the hum you'd hear from those big overhead lights in a gym. It didn't belong at the beach. I sat up and looked over at Ryan. I could tell the moment he heard it too because his whole expression changed. We started scanning the darkness, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. It was so faint that we couldn't pinpoint the source. We both felt uneasy but stayed put, hoping it would just go away. There was no way anyone could see us out there. It was pitch dark, and the sound of the waves would have drowned out any noise we'd made. I know it doesn't sound terrifying, but my heart was pounding. The buzzing sound continued, and after a few more minutes, Ryan motioned for us to leave. I nodded without hesitation. But the second we stood up, the buzzing sound jumped from barely noticeable to loud and overwhelming. I swear, it felt like the sound was right next to us. I froze. Every hair on my body stood up, and my chest tightened with fear. We turned toward the dunes, desperate to get out of there, but Ryan suddenly grabbed my arm and stopped me. At first, I didn't understand why he wasn't moving, but then I saw it. Standing at the top of the dune was a figure. It was tall, ridiculously tall, and its arms hung so low they almost reached its knees. It didn't move, didn't even flinch. It just stood there, completely still, like it was watching us. Ryan snapped me out of it, yelling for me to run, and we took off, sprinting parallel to the beach instead of heading directly for the dunes. When we finally reached the next entrance, we scrambled up the slope, and before heading down the other side, we looked back. I wish I hadn't looked. Not only was the first figure still there, but now there were 3, maybe 4, more figures standing motionless on the slope, all facing us. We didn't stop. We ran all the way back to Ryan's house, leaving our bikes behind. The next morning, we went back to look for them, but they were gone. Maybe someone took them, or maybe it was something else. I honestly don't know. The whole night still haunts me. The buzzing sound, the figures, and the way it all seemed so intentional. It felt wrong in every way. And to this day, I have never heard a sound like that buzzing again. Story 3. Beaches never used to scare me. In fact, some of my best childhood memories are from summers spent at the shore. But everything changed after what happened that summer when I was 16. I can trace my fear directly to the events of that weekend. It was supposed to be one of those unforgettable summers. My 2 best friends, Charlie and Ryan, and I were heading down to Charlie's beach house in Long Beach Island, New Jersey, for a weekend without any adult supervision. Ryan had just gotten his license, so he was driving us down. The trip was a mix of excitement and laughter, mostly at Ryan's questionable driving skills. We got there in good time, unpacked, and settled into our rooms. The layout of the house is important, so let me explain it briefly. There was a front door, a garage door connecting the front and backyards, a sliding glass door in the back, and an upstairs deck with a spiral staircase leading to the ground level. The house backed onto a lagoon with docks and houses lining the opposite shore. That night, we invited 3 girls we knew, Rosie, Alexis, and Sophie, to hang out. We had alcohol and enough weed to last the weekend, so we were set. The night started perfectly. We hung out, drank, smoked, and ended up lounging in the backyard pool. The warm night breeze and the rising steam from the heated water made it feel like paradise. But then, everything shifted. Charlie turned down the music and stared past me into the darkness across the lagoon. Confused, I turned to look. I could just barely make out the opposite dock and the outline of houses. Charlie whispered that he saw someone standing there. I laughed it off, thinking he was joking. But then he said, "I know the family that lives there. They're in Florida this week." That made my stomach drop. The girls, now visibly uneasy, wanted to go inside. We agreed, but as we were drying off, Ryan cursed and pointed to the lagoon. I turned and saw movement on the opposite dock. My heart pounded. A car drove by on the opposite road, briefly lighting up the dock, and that's when we saw them. 4 tall silhouettes stood at the edge, motionless and facing us. We froze. Charlie's voice was shaky as he said, "Inside. Now." We ran to the sliding door, locking it behind us. Then we heard it. For splashes. They were swimming across the lagoon. Panic took over. Riley locked the back door while Charlie ran to lock the front. We huddled in a room that wasn't visible from outside, our breaths heavy and erratic. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Then Ryan whispered, "The upstairs deck door. It's unlocked." And just as he said it, we heard footsteps above us. That was it. We bolted for the front door, piled into Ryan's car, and sped away. Ryan was so flustered he knocked over Charlie's mailbox backing out of the driveway. Once we were far enough away, we called the police. The aftermath was devastating. We returned with the cops to find the house ransacked. Valuables were missing from the top floor. Worse, Charlie's family's Boston whaler boat was gone. The police guessed the intruders used it as a getaway. Charlie's dad had kept a spare key in a hidden compartment under the steering wheel, and it seemed like whoever broke in knew exactly where to find it. The police never caught them, and we were left with more questions than answers. Was it someone who knew Charlie's family? Did they know the house would be empty? Years later, I still can't fully shake that night. I triple-check my doors and windows every night. My advice? Always lock your doors. And never take safety for granted, even in the most peaceful places.